Welcome, everyone. I think I'll take this slow as we're going to have more participants joining. But I just wanted to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Post COP30 Action, Climate and Health in an International Context. I'm going to be moderating today. My name is Leah Darbyson. I'm a current board member of the Group of 78. I'm also on the executive committee. I started out mostly just volunteering with the group, hence I'm much younger than everybody, which is probably my favorite part. So just to introduce, many of you might be familiar with the Group of 78, but those who aren't, it's a foreign policy nonprofit based in Ottawa, working for peace, security, climate action, and social justice through progressive Canadian foreign policy and renewed multilateralism. It's an absolute pleasure to be moderating this. This is my first time moderating a webinar, so it's a real treat. Before we started, I wanted to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather. This is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who have lived here for thousands of years at this gathering point at the confluence of the three rivers. We recognize the ongoing damage perpetrated on this land and its original peoples by our colonial institutions. As a foreign policy nonprofit, the Group of 78 strongly supports the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Group of 78 has lots to learn and much to gain by integrating Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into our work and in our partnerships to be an effective ally. This is not something that is new, and it's not something that's going to stop. So we hope that everybody can always stay in touch to see the ongoing work that we'll be doing. So just diving into the conference, I would really like to briefly echo the spirit of a land acknowledgement by noting that the conversations that we'll be having today on climate and health are inseparable from all the questions of land, governance, and responsibility, particularly because the issues that we're discussing today are in no way isolated, they're in no way abstract, and they're absolutely not distributed evenly. With that in mind, it's a real pleasure to start to kick off the conference or the webinar. With COP30 having recently concluded in Brazil, this is a timely moment for us to kind of step back and look at some more of the difficult questions. So we're going to be looking at things like, what does the global climate process actually deliver and where is it falling short? More importantly, what are Canada's obligations and opportunities on the international stage? How should health conversations and health evidence be considered and shape Canada's climate policy choices in the years ahead? This is especially in the current era of geopolitical uncertainty, policy backsliding, and emerging forms of multilateralism and multilateral cooperation with or without current actors. So today's session is meant to be we want this to be a good conversation. So we'll be starting off with a bit more of a framing by our guest speaker, and then we'll open things up for discussion afterwards. So now I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker, Robb Barnes. He's the Climate Program Director at the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and was a delegate at the recent COP30 back in November. He brings over 16 years of experience working on climate and environmental issues, including previous roles as executive directors of Ecology Ottawa and the Capacity Building Institute. His work is focused on climate-friendly cities, engagement-based organizing, and data-driven communications, with a particular emphasis on links between climate change, policy, and public health. Today, Robb is going to help us tackle the intersection of climate change, health, and situate Canada's role within the broader international climate landscape following the COP30. So I'm going to hand this off to you, Robb, and I'm going to note for the audience, if you don't mind just taking notes of anything you would like to discuss, and we can, Robb, you can decide when you want to bring in the audience. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Leah, and good afternoon or morning, everyone, depending on where you are across this big, beautiful, very cold country at the moment. I think there'll be, so in terms of areas for audience engagement, maybe one right off the top, I'll ask you a couple questions. I'd love to get a sense of the room. And then about at the halfway mark of this talk, we'll kind of like pop out of the presentation and ask some questions. See if anyone has any kind of concepts they'd like to clear up or ideas that they have in light of the talk. But yeah, so and then of course at the end we can do a Q&A. In terms of questions off the top, though, I'd love to know. Maybe I have one for the group, and it's how do you think Canada is doing on climate change? Take that however you want, but maybe we'll put it on a 1 to 3 scale, and let's make 1 the high end. Canada is like doing amazing work on climate change. We're great. We're in good shape. 2, we're somewhere in the middle. 3, it's not looking so hot lately. Not so good in terms of Canada's performance. So yeah, if it's possible to use the chat and give me a 1 to 3 rating, 1 being the highest, how do you think Canada is doing right now on climate change? I'd love to get a sense of the room, and if the folks here are highly in favor of what's happening, or perhaps more skeptical. Linda, thank you. Linda's on the more skeptical side. Okay, we'll get 3s across the board. I was going to ask, of course, how well. I often ask in talks, how well does everyone track the issue? And of course, with G78, the answer is you're all ones. You're all tracking the issue very closely. You're on a webinar about climate change. So I take it that all these ratings that I'm reading here, thank you very much for everyone filling them in. They're highly informed ratings. And 4. Elizabeth is not happy. I will go through Canada's performance. At the front end, we're going to talk a little bit about the climate health connections. And then the back end, we'll talk about Canada, especially in the international context, especially in light of COP30, as Leah implied. Before I get going too, I'll just say a quick word of introduction about myself. I'm Robb Barnes. Thanks, Leah, for the introduction. I'm based in Ottawa. I've worked on climate issues for 15, 16 years or so in different roles. I volunteer. I've helped found organizations. I sometimes do the books on organizations. Sometimes I'm the executive director. So it really depends on the day. Different roles in the nonprofit sector for the most part. So I really hope to bring that perspective, and especially CAPE's emphasis. This is Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment's emphasis on the importance of health, planetary health. And so without any further ado, I will do my best to share my screen, and I will share it now. Okay, can everyone?
Yeah, I can see it from my end.
Excellent. Okay. So I guess just start hollering at me if there's any issues in terms of lag or whatever. But here we are. Thanks for coming. Climate action, health, and the international context. We're going to talk about everything. And I want to hear from you too, in terms of your impressions, your ideas, your responses to some of the concepts being bandied about here. So I'm going to try to take about 20 minutes for the first tranche here. So we'll, at about the 12:30 mark, we can kind of like take stock and see where we're at. So, here we go. Nice to meet you. I already introduced myself. This is me and a stray cat that I met in Azerbaijan when I was there at COP29 last year. Lots of stray cats and dogs in all these cities where COP is held. This cat, very zen, and some of us, I'm sure, are trying to emulate that cat's performance in light of geopolitical events, as Leah alluded to. Everything is topsy-turvy, and the climate crisis is real and bearing down on us, but if we can all be a little bit more like that cat, we'd be in good shape. So here is something that folks probably have seen, a lot of folks on this call have seen, from the AR6 synthesis report from the IPCC. This is basically, a quick slide that shows, kids born in 2020, I'm thinking in particular of my son who was born in 2018, the kinds of futures that they will be exposed to under different emission scenarios, right? So does warming continue beyond 2100? Do we reach 1.5 degrees centigrade as an upper limit? Do we blast past that into 2, 2.5, 3? And that's a live debate, as you might imagine, in the COP context, is 1.5 degrees dead? And happy to kind of contextualize that, but that's certainly something that comes up. And so, yeah, there are what we do now matters. What Canada does matters, despite what some folks say, which is that, it's a vanishingly small percentage of the total emissions in the world. It's not, and our per capita emissions are still some of the highest in the world. So there's a real incumbency on developed countries like Canada to do a lot and be ambitious here. Um, so you don't need a lecture on whether or not climate change will affect us in the future or is affecting us now. It is, of course. And of course, there are different analyses from different groups in terms of like what does the difference, let's say, between 1.5 versus 2 degrees look like in terms of loss of plant species, loss of insect species, and of course, there's extreme heat, sea ice free, etc., coral reefs. But I think the thing that is on many of our minds in the climate space, and folks who are just concerned citizens, is tipping points, right? Like, at what point does a certain amount of warming trigger a catastrophic rise in sea levels that leads to a number of other pieces. For example, greater heat because of the albedo effect. There's a bunch of pieces, right, that can flow, and then of course there's geopolitical tensions underlying those. Let's say water scarcity issues in the Pakistan India region come to mind as a potential trigger point for geopolitical conflict. So all this is known, but all this is to say that there's a big difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and of course blasting past 2, which it sometimes looks like we're likely to do, brings with it a whole host of other challenges. But I've got good news for folks. I'm not all doom and gloom. The energy transition is very much underway. It's not inevitable. I think sometimes we kind of slip into this kind of phrasing where we're saying like, well, Trump might have gotten elected, but the energy transition is going to happen regardless of Trump. Yes and no. I mean, certainly political actors can affect outcomes. But we are seeing that solar is expected to become the world's largest source of electricity by 2033. And this is 2 years old now. This is from the World Energy Outlook. I bet if I went back and looked at the data now, it would be looking possible, well, maybe better, maybe worse than this. Often the case with solar is that it looks better, but I'm thinking, since 2024, Trump has come on the scene and a lot of companies and private sector actors have backtracked on climate. But we do still see solar and other renewables taking the world by storm. And this little image is pretty compelling, right? It shows that actual installations of solar have been more than 3 times higher than their 5-year forecasts. So basically, if anyone tells you they know where solar is going, they're probably wrong, and they're probably undercounting the performance of solar. And I'm not saying that solar is the most important renewable energy. I'm just focusing on it because we've got some good data in terms of solar dispersal. But similarly with wind or geothermal or battery storage, and all these things do tend to overlap in complementary ways. So there is good news out there in terms of the trends. And of course, there's a rationale for change. And this is something that CAPE likes to talk about, and I like to talk about at CAPE. When we talk about climate change, and this is borrowing from UN terms, we talk about mitigation, right? Dealing with warming, basically. And we talk about adaptation, which is responding to the warming that's already in the system. But in the context of health, when we talk about mitigating climate change, we're really talking about, at CAPE at least, tackling air pollution. It's a bit of a different message, right? We do want to talk about the climate crisis. We don't want to stop saying climate change, but we want to talk about what it means in the very short term, which is health consequences. And so tackling air pollution means preventing health impacts and reducing the amount of resources and efforts required to adapt, including strains on our health system, right? We've got a very expensive health system that is still the pride and joy of Canadians in poll after poll in terms of having a publicly available health system. So it's incumbent on us to do the things that will protect it. And that's to say lower costs by reducing exposures to pollutants. The health component of adaptation, I think in some ways is clearer than mitigation, because we're not talking about air pollution. We're talking about all the things that happen when climate changes. So wildfires, drought, zoonotic diseases, floods, heat, right? And many, many more, as I mentioned, the geopolitical risk of nuclear war, et cetera. Like there are a number of kind of like knock-on effects of climate change, but certainly the adaptation piece kind of clearly intersects with language around health. So let's think about, where all this problem comes from. And here, let me just put an asterisk. We talk in the climate space and the climate movement in Canada in general, we talk about coal, oil, and gas. That's not to say that there aren't other sources of emissions. And here I'm thinking in particular of farming and the agricultural system and meat production and livestock production. And I touch on that a little bit here. But generally speaking, I'm going to be focused on the major, the most salient impact in terms of climate change, which is fossil fuel burning. And so here we've got a bit. This is a bit dated now. This is from 2020, but this is one of these classic sectoral breakdowns that Canada provides and says, here's where our emissions are coming from, right? We got some oil and gas over here. We got some transportation emissions over here. Our buildings, it takes a lot of energy to heat, cool, and electrify our buildings. Electricity is a separate source. There's agriculture, as I mentioned, heavy industry, and then waste. But I'd like to kind of problematize this. And here I'm borrowing from my colleague, Rick Smith, who runs the Canadian Climate Institute. And I was chatting with Rick one day and he said, we look at these pie charts and it looks complicated and variegated. But as it turns out, all this stuff is actually, and this is the modified slide, it's actually oil and gas production, like for the vast majority. We talk about, and I'll toggle between the two, right? Oil and gas production, that's obviously clear. What are the emissions coming from when we power up our vehicles for transportation systems? Well, comes from oil and gas. What about buildings, heating and cooling buildings? That requires oil and gas. And so you get the point. Oil and gas is prominent throughout the entire across sectors. It's a multi-sectoral challenge, right? And so when we talk about tackling climate change, there's a reason why we talk about oil and gas. And when Kate talks about climate change, as I mentioned, what we want to talk about instead or in addition to is the fact that all this stuff leads to air pollution. And then that's the most immediate effect. And then the more not long-term effect is climate impacts, right? And this, of course, varies depending on which gases we're talking about. Methane, heats at a rate much quicker than CO2, for example. But generally speaking, when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking about air pollution and we're talking about climate impacts. So what's the rationale for change? This is interesting. Okay, here we go. What's the rationale for change? Well, you get different estimates in terms of like what these impacts are like. So Health Canada, a fairly recent analysis said they think, roughly, and of course, whenever we talk about science, there's an error bar on either side of these claims, right? Air pollution, above background air pollution contributes to 15,300 premature deaths in Canada. So that's a lot in a population of 40 million. And then, but a higher number came out of a fairly recent study in Harvard. That's more like 1 in 7 premature deaths in Canada are related to fossil fuel air pollution. So different estimates, different methodologies, but we know, I think with a great deal of confidence, that tens of thousands of people are dying earlier than they otherwise would because of fossil fuel related air pollution in Canada. And that's Canada, right? Like there are other countries where air pollution is much, much worse because of fossil fuels. I'm thinking India in particular, China for years, and it's a problem that is becoming quickly resolved as they electrify. But certainly, even in a developed country with all sorts of regulations and standards, the way that we have them in Canada, there's still a serious challenge around air quality. Kate put some of these numbers together in a fairly recent report that I helped write called Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise, where we basically just took government data on their estimated cost savings from various regulations. So basically what the feds do when they bring out a regulation is they run it through a number of models and they say, well, we estimate that this will lower air pollution by X and that this leads to the following health effects. And I'm just looking at 4 regulations here. There were coal regulations brought in around 1990. I'm mixing up with another set of regulations. No, the coal regulations more recent in the teens. Methane regulations, CER, or the Clean Electricity Regulations, which the government just weakened, and VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And the total savings for these 4 regulations, when we adjusted, to 2024 currency, and we took away, we played around with the discount rate, which happy to unpack that if folks want to go into it. It's around $21 billion in total health savings. So what we wanted to do is put this report out in the context of the federal election and say, like, there's a lot at stake, right? When parties talk about scrapping regulations to cut red tape, there are consequences, and there are health consequences, and there are fiscal consequences related to those health consequences that we should be aware of when we're making these kinds of choices as an electorate. Um, I am not a doctor. I often have to warn people at the beginning of every one of my talks, especially if we're in person, that if anything goes wrong, I can't help you. But I do know doctors. I can call them afterwards. I am, but I joke quite regularly that I'm not a physician. However, I do have a basic understanding of major air pollutants and what they do to our body. And so here are some of the kind of the big ones that come up when we talk about air pollution at Cape. There's ozone, there's particulate matter, which is another word for gunk that gets trapped in your lungs. Gunk of various sizes. There's the 2.5 variety, which is 2.5 microns or less, and the PM10, which is 10 microns or less. And PM2, they do different things, but PM2.5 is generally the one that comes up in a lot of studies around air, the effects of air pollution. Nitrogen oxides, and in particular nitrogen dioxide, tends to be a bad actor. Sulfur dioxide, if folks who study air pollution will call these the NOx and the SOx, right? You've got the nitrogen oxides and your sulfur oxides, and they're all bad, but in different ways. And then volatile organic compounds. When we think of methane gas, for example, that's a lot of natural gas and volatile organic compounds mixed in together. So it's the vast majority is just natural gas, or fossil gas, as we sometimes call it at Cape, combined with VOCs, and has a whole range of negative effects. But VOCs actually come off of a variety of other things. For example, paint thinners in your house. You might be inhaling VOCs right now from your furniture or from other chemical other sources in your house. But here I'm thinking in particular of the VOCs associated with burning of fossil fuels. And they all do different things, as I mentioned. But generally, and I won't kind of drill in here because, again, I'm not a physician, but a lot of these lead to respiratory or cardiovascular issues. So there's a short-term, usually effect in a lot of cases of irritation, right? Your body is showing signs of inflammation and indicating to you that perhaps you shouldn't be breathing the thing that you're breathing, but then the long-term effects are, related to respiratory or cardiovascular function, and then chronic diseases. You've got asthma, you've got cognitive impairment, there's cancer, there's premature death, there's preterm births in many cases. So air pollution remains, again, in the context of a country like Canada, where we sometimes don't think of it, sorry, going back to the last slide, remains a major challenge, and something that we need to be aware of, especially when, and it remains in some cases understudied. I think of, for example, the rise in gas-fired electricity across Ontario. What are those plants doing for local air quality? We have some indications, but it's not systematically studied at this stage. There's some studies out of the States, mostly around coal plants, but really interesting questions can and should be asked about the health effects of gas-fired electricity. And I'm just kind of naming that as just one more source of fossil fuel air pollution, right? Like, it's not necessarily saying that you should look there and they will be the worst. But what I'm saying is that anytime you burn fossil fuels, there are risks. And it turns out that our various levels of government continue to double down on fossil fuel infrastructure. And so we need to be pretty systematic and evidence-based in terms of our understanding of what those health effects are. Now, the next slide is all about Canada in context. And that's my prompt to just stop sharing just for a second, because we've just kind of covered a very broad gamut of climate and health. And many of you, I know much more than I do about climate and probably a health as well. So this is before we jump into Canada in context, but I just wanted to see if there are any thoughts, questions, or ideas in light of the slides at this stage. And I'll pause there.
Thank you, Rob.
So I don't know, Leah, if it's easiest for people to just write them in the chat, or
Yeah, so I was going to say, if anyone wants to write in the chat, and then I'm also wondering if there's a way to see if you raise your hand. And I can let you speak.
Rita, it's great to see you on this call. It's been a long time since I think we connected in a room in Toronto like 10 years ago when I was working with Climate Action Network Canada. I'm so glad to see you here, and I will definitely share the slides after this presentation. Thanks, Susan, as well. Slides will definitely be shared. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So, and if folks like the slides. Well, there are more slides where those came from. So why don't we jump back into the slideshow? Maybe I'll just give it another 10 seconds or so.
Yeah. I have some questions written out as well, but I just wanted to save those to the end of the discussion, if
Okay,
that's okay.
perfect. Um, you know what? Did I lose my slides? Not there. Okay, there we go. Oh no. Here, I'm just gonna, if you give me a second, I'm gonna find my slides again. This is the joys of the joys of Zoom presentations, right? Where we're like our slides
Yeah.
just disappear on us. Oh, here we go. Fiona, can we expect a report on the pollution from the burning of fossil fuels for heating Ontario? That's a great question, Fiona. And the good thing, I don't know the answer to that, but I do have friends and colleagues who might know the answer to that. The good thing about CAPE as a national organization is that we have strong presence in all of the provinces, with the sad exception of PEI. We still need a CAPE group in PEI. So if anyone is on the call from PEI, please let me know. But we do have a really robust Ontario regional committee, and they have their a pretty strong sense of which reports on pollution from burning of fossil fuels have come out or are slated to come out in the context of Ontario. So I'll keep that. I'll take a note of that. Burning fossil fuels for homes, and I will take that back when I share. I'm going to share the slides, and I'll try to answer that question or point you in the right direction there, Fiona. Just making a note. And I've got the slides back up. So Leah, if without any further ado, if you're all right, I'm going to share my screen again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Can you see this? It says it's
Still
paused.
loading on my end. Oh,
Okay.
it just disconnected.
Try again. Try again. Try again. Here. Can we see this?
Yes, I can see that.
And we're starting at the beginning here, but I'm going to blast through to the relevant slide and continue the chat. Okay. Sorry for the whiplash here as I blast through about 20 slides. So we were going to talk about the Canadian context. Where does Canada sit internationally? I saw folks giving it threes. I saw one give, I think, a two to three, and then I saw someone give it a four. So, which is outside of our grade range. So people on this call are well aware of the fact that Canada's performance perhaps has slipped in recent years, perhaps was never very good to begin with, or perhaps your take is, yeah, it's pretty decent, but maybe not as good as it can be, or maybe it's not doing well on the international stage. We'll talk about all these different kind of lenses as we go through. So let me just give you a kind of context. This is something that I think a bunch of us know, but I'll try to flesh it out, right? Canada 2 years ago and the climate movement even 2 years ago is very different from where it is today under the Mark Carney government federally. And I shouldn't pin this all on Mark Carney, and I hope folks don't get that impression. What I'm trying to do with these national level emissions displays is this is the cumulative effect of all of Canada's emissions, right? So that every province is involved here, every municipality, and the federal government. The federal government will take it on the chin because they're the ones at the head of the bus, so to speak. But it's not just federal action that we're talking about. We're talking about, expansion of gas-fired power plants, for example, in the context of Ontario, or new fracking in BC, or, the lifting of the moratorium and fracking in the Maritimes. So there's a bunch of pieces that are going into this. But Canada as a country, especially abroad, will wear it because, they're the representatives of this big, complicated federation. So here was our emissions curve in 2023. What it would have looked like had we had no carbon policy to speak of. And I'm looking at 2015. If you look at, this is where the red line separates from the blue, right? So 2015, we all know Justin Trudeau becomes Prime Minister of Canada. And all of a sudden, instead of no carbon policy, there's a bunch of different climate policies all interacting in interesting ways. By the time this analysis came out in 2023, they were looking at a bunch of different pathways, right? They knew what was legislated This is Canadian Climate Institute, by the way, and their shop that does this analysis is called 440 megatons, which does tremendous work. Um, so what was legislated, what was developing, and the numbers there, I believe, are megatons of CO2. So 549 megatons would be, reduced through legislation, 506 through developing policy, and then there's stuff that the government, and I will blame every government in the history of time for doing this. They like to talk about what they're going to do, and then they don't always do the thing that they're going to do. So they'll like to announce things, especially on the global stage. Trudeau was guilty of this. He'd go to New York and talk about a policy that wasn't enacted yet. And then journalists would be asking us about it, and we'd say, "Well, it doesn't exist. It's a dream in the eye of the prime minister at the stage." And so to take credit for it is a little bit disingenuous. But politicians are going to be politicians, so that's what they do. So there's the announced, less stringent, and then there's more stringent targets, more stringent action, and then of course there's what's the 2030 target, and what's the net zero pathway. So that's where we were in 2023, and I'll just get a quote from the Canadian Climate Institute. They're really my go-to on a lot of this like federal level analysis. They're really, really good. And they're actually they've been set up by the feds as an arms length body to basically keep the feds accountable on climate change. So here we go. 2023 quote, Canada's made significant progress in implementing policies to reduce carbon emissions, but more is needed to put the country on track to its 2026 interim objective and 2030 emissions reduction target. So what is that? That's like a B minus. That's a C plus. That's like a attaboy. Canada's moving in the right direction. We're not there yet. We can be there. It's within reach. Net zero is within reach, which is saying something, especially considering where we had been prior to the Trudeau administration under Harper, which was, an attempt to build pipelines everywhere under the sun and to heck with climate targets, et cetera. So. Certainly reverse the decline of the Harper era, but still a lot further to go. And then, by contrast, this is 2 years later. This is Rick Smith, the ED of the Canadian Climate Institute. Canada is now significantly off track to meeting its emissions targets. And another piece that's bolded: current policies will not deliver the results necessary to achieve the country's 2030 or 2035 climate targets. Another word that the Canadian Climate Institute and several others used in the context of this analysis was fragile. Our progress is fragile, and it's at risk of basically crumbling because of policy reversals. And unfortunately, since that statement has gone out, we've seen more policy reversals. So I would expect our emissions trajectory to look worse than what Rick Smith was talking about when he was quoted in 2025. So here we have, this is the same, these are the same numbers from the last graph, so nothing's changed here, but I've just circled the legislated, developing, and announced just to show you what changes have been made there. So of course, famously now, the consumer-facing carbon price was scrapped as soon as Carney took over leadership of the Liberal government. There was a big piece of policy called the oil and gas emissions cap, which had been announced. So this was under the announced file. That was scrapped, unceremoniously scrapped in 2025, and is no longer going to see the light of day. This would have been the federal government's first ever attempt to actually regulate emissions from its highest emitting sector, which was oil and gas. If you recall the graph there, the pie chart at the beginning of this talk. So that was a really important one that was scrapped. Clean electricity regulations. Whether this was, depending on where this landed in the legislated, developed, or announced piece, it was basically already passed in 2024, right? So I guess it would have been legislated at some stage. But with the Canada-Alberta MOU, which the feds and Premier Danielle Smith recently rolled out, all of a sudden there was a big carve out on the efficacy of that major policy. And then finally, regulations on methane. This is one of the ones where Trudeau was bragging about it, I think in 2022 in Dubai, maybe 2023 in Dubai, and yet it hadn't seen the light of day. In fact, died on the order paper when the federal election was called, and was just passed in a weakened form last month. So methane policy is the first and so far the only positive climate initiative under the Carney government. But meanwhile, there's weakening across the board. in a number of areas. So this is just to give you a context of where we are at the beginning of 2026, mostly with a focus on federal policy. Of course, the provinces, I don't think have covered themselves in glory in terms of compensating for the lack of federal ambition. And then you're just two maybe radically different reactions to the Canada-Alberta MOU. I've read polling on this. Canadians don't understand that MOU. I mean, sometimes neither do I, but I do see smart people having different reactions. Guilbeault quit Mark Carney's cabinet over it. But then other colleagues in the sector, perhaps on the more industry-friendly side of the sector, this is a group called Clean Prosperity. They like the Alberta-Canada MOU. I think they're the only ones in the sector that do seem to like it. The vast majority, I'd say, in the environmental movement are strongly critical of the Alberta-Canada MOU because of the number of carve-outs involved. So that's where Canada's at domestically, and this shows up on the international stage. So this is a shot of, I'm very privileged in my job. I get to travel in some cases to these COPs, and sometimes with some really amazing physicians. CAPE, after all, is a physician-led organization. And so incredibly, we get these brilliant physicians to show up on the world stage when we go to things like this one's COP28 in Dubai. There's Dr. Courtney Howard on the left. Some of you might know of Courtney. She's rather prominent as a public figure on climate change and health. And Dr. Joe Vipond, also prominent, especially if anyone on this call is from Alberta. I get told from Albertans all the time that he's Alberta famous. So he's a well-known Calgary physician. They're both ER docs, so maybe there's something in the water for ER docs and getting involved with CAPE. They know an emergency when they see one, and the climate emergency is it. So there they are. And here we go as we talk about the international context. So maybe let's zoom out. And I'm remembering the ratings that we gave Canada at the beginning, right? 3s across the board, pretty consistent. This is one. There is a bunch of different NGOs in the international space that do a little bit of a report card on where countries are at in terms of their overall climate performance, especially relative to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And Climate Action Tracker is one of my go-tos for that information. And what they'll do is they'll take all of the country's documentation and they'll try to give it it's not one grade, but it's a few grades, right? So, well, I guess it is one grade in the sense that they give it an overall rating. So Canada's rating as of August 2024 was insufficient, kind of an orange bar. And that's because our policies and action were insufficient to help achieve a world of under 3 degrees centigrade, let alone 1.5. Our NDC, this is UN jargon for nationally determined contribution, or basically our climate target, was almost sufficient for a less than 2 degree world. But of course, when we factor in the fair share, and this is the idea that developed countries owe more because of their historic burning of fossil fuels, right? If you think about how did Canada get to be the very wealthy country we are now, we were burning fossil fuels for a very long time, right? In a way that an advantage that India and China and others didn't have, right? So there's this kind of developed versus developing binary that sometimes applies. And when we talk about fair share, that's what they can factor that into the analysis and run the numbers and say, well, our NDC target is even worse when you consider the fact that Canada has historically been burning lots of fossil fuels. Finally, climate finance. How much is Canada giving to the developing countries of the world that require money for mitigation? We talked about that, and adaptation right now. And the short answer is not enough. Highly insufficient against the targets set by various actors in the international community. Hopefully that all makes sense. Then there's some other stuff here, net zero target, land use and forestry. Let's not rate it. But all this is to say, Canada was seen as insufficient by this fairly credible third-party evaluator in 2024. And this is us closer to today. This is 2025, November 2025. We've moved from, and I'm going to toggle back and forth here, from insufficient to highly insufficient. And now our policies and actions are highly insufficient for anything less than a 4-degree warming world. Climate finance remains the same. So not great, right? Canada's not doing well on the international stage and not doing well domestically. And again, I promise not to spend all my time depressing you, the audience. I want to. There are signs of hope that I'll talk about in the end. But let me just contrast Canada to another country or to other countries on the scene. There's EU. So look, I'll toggle back and forth. November 2025, Canada was highly insufficient. The EU, by contrast, this is slightly more dated information. Insufficient. So not great, right? Like where's our shining star? Well, Costa Rica. I was looking around the world for like a best in class, and Costa Rica is one of the ones that shows up most prominently, has the most green associated with it, and even they score an almost sufficient in terms of their overall rating. And you can see they're not applicable for climate finance because they're not considered a developed country, even though their human development index is now like really, really high. So different countries are held against different standards based on their history, etc. So what does the world look like? Well, it's not a great picture, right? So you might notice the large areas of gray: the United States, Russia, Mexico, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, critically insufficient. So not even like showing up essentially for the ball game. Then countries like Canada and China now highly insufficient. You get some insufficient. There's Norway, a bright light a little bit at the top, and I see Costa Rica is yellow. So not great, right? All things considered, this is the current context as we wrestle with whatever 2026 will bring on climate change and talk about COP30. So what happened at COP30? Of course, it was in Brazil. Lula, the president of Brazil, wanted to bring it to the Amazon, the idea being that show the world what's at risk. And I don't have the slide here, but there are some really interesting kind of like numbers tracking graphs on terms of COP attendance over time, right? The early COP, first of all, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. In case that wasn't clear, I apologize. I always slip into acronym use here. The early COPs were, tiny little things, a few thousand people getting together in Bonn or Berlin to talk about climate policy. And Bonn is the kind of international headquarters for the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It started out as a specialized and policy-driven conversation, and now it's sometimes described, I've heard it described most compellingly as a bit of a three-ring circus. So, and a three-ring circus that involves 50 to 80 or 90,000 people, depending on the year. And Brazil was, I think, closer to 55,000. The first ring is the original COP, right? This is where the negotiations are taking place. This is sometimes literally a room where people, policymakers from around the world, are going over a Google Doc and they are editing it together. That's COP. That is the meat and potatoes of COP. You zoom out a little bit, the second ring of the circus, big, flashy announcements, bilateral deals, multilateral deals. Trudeau will come by back when he did, get up on a stage and talk about his new methane targets, or the fact that Canada was the first country in the world to roll out an ambitious adaptation strategy. That's the second ring of the three-ring circus, I'd say. Big official delegations doing their thing, being politicians. Third ring out is where CAPE fits in and so many other actors. This is the civil society space. There's protests. There's private sector actors too, trying to talk about their new technologies. It's a very dynamic space, and it's become the go-to annual confab for 50 to 60 to 90,000 people who care deeply about climate change, or in some cases care about reversing action on climate change, because increasingly there's a fossil fuel lobbyist contingent. They're part of the three-ring circus as well. So it's pure chaos, basically, to sum it up very quickly. And COP30 did not disappoint. Now, CAPE this year was able to go with a fairly large delegation of physicians. We had actually 5 different doctors who were joining us. And incredibly, the CAPE doctors all pay their own way. Like it's a pretty remarkable organization that way. These are all volunteers who are coming in on their free time and not sleeping, doing the flight path for 36 hours to show up and talk about climate and engage on climate and health. So the bottom or the left, there was a little protest that CAPE did where we were holding up what we were calling the lungs of the world. You can't see me, but I'm behind the lung trying to keep it up, trying to keep it upright. And we actually had like a hair dryer that we were blowing into. This thing was like full of holes, so we were trying to like keep it inflated as we did our protest. But we wanted to draw attention to Canada's performance, and that's something that Dr. Melissa Lem on the right, she's talking to CBC's Susan Ormsted about the LNG projects that the Carney government was announcing in the middle of COP. So it's like timing is everything, and the timing was poor for Canada's major projects announcements as we were at COP and trying to talk about the urgency and the necessity for Canada to act. Canada was busy moving in the opposite direction. So I've got some good, bad, and ugly takeaways from COP that I'd love to share. Um, so what happened at this COP? And again, this like COP, there are people who can study their entire lives. I know lots of people who've done their PhDs on COPs. Like it has its own very unique language and acronyms and stuff. So I don't want to, if anyone wants to go into detail, we can. I wouldn't say I'm a generalist, so there are going to be areas that I don't know about. But generally speaking, high level victories at COP. Well, we got this thing called the Just Transition Mechanism. What the heck is a Just Transition Mechanism? Well, civil society had been pushing for something like that. They gave it the catchier acronym of BAM, or the Balem Action Mechanism. The idea, just transition, when you hear it in the civil society international space, is the idea that when you're transitioning away from fossil fuels, it's complicated and hard, especially for workers, right? There are all sorts of workers whose livelihoods are tied to oil and gas or to the fossil fuel economy or to the old way of doing things that need to be basically helped, reskilled, retrained, subsidized. All sorts of supports need to be in place for those workers to transition to a different kind of economy. That's the gist, I think, of just transition. Although different folks will come at it with different lenses about an intersectional just mechanism or one that delivers social justice for the greatest number. So there's a bunch of different, maybe more or less ambitious interpretations of just transition. But all this is to say, the COP succeeded in arriving at an agreement to prioritize just transition going forward. And also, this COP agreed on, believe it or not, this will sound very mundane, but tracking measures for climate adaptation. This is the idea that, like, we know that climate is having all sorts of impacts in the daily lives of people, but which ones should we track to get a sense of how bad it is? And believe it or not, this was like a multi-year long discussion in COP, and different countries were coming forward. At one point, there were thousands of potential indicators for what constitutes effective tracking of climate adaptation. Well, good news, everyone. COP30 landed on a finalized version of the tracking indicators. And it sounds boring, but it's really, really important for understanding as a globe where we're headed in terms of climate impacts. And we set climate finance targets. And here, the we I'm using is like the globe, the global community of nations. There's a new goal of tripling adaptation finance, right, to over 120 billion dollars a year, mobilizing other finance. And finance, as I mentioned earlier, this is the money that the developed world sends to the developing world to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. So this is like really, really important. In fact, I'd say lately COP can be summed up in one phrase, and that's just show me the money. Where's the money? There's all this agreement on targets. This is fine, but the money has not yet started flowing in a very robust way. And I'd say that maybe that's for later. That's for the bad. The Lula government, the Brazil government, wanted to talk about fossil fuel transition. At the end of the day, they agreed on something called a roadmap for a fossil fuel transition, and they also agreed that the details would be hammered out in a space that was outside of the formal UNFCCC COP process. So these are going to be some side meetings, something to watch closely, and maybe at some point it'll feed back in to where we're at. But I will say that in a context in which we're operating in these COPs, which is multilateral and where it's consensus driven, everyone gets a veto. So when Saudi Arabia and Russia get a veto on whether or not to transition away from oil and gas, you will never have language that says you can transition away from oil and gas. So not to position those two as the sole baddies in COP, but I will say that those names came up fairly often this year in terms of groups that were blocking action. EU actually covered itself in a bit of glory this year. It came forward with a bunch of ambitious mitigation plans, like a rare bright light at COP, just to see a cluster of countries representing a lot of the economy of the world saying we can do better and we can go further on climate mitigation. And Canada, I'd say, to the credit of its negotiators, sided with a coalition pushing to keep the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, as the scientific standard. What does that mean? Well, the IPCC, these are the guys who pump out those reports. That early graph at the beginning that I showed you, it's from an IPCC synthesis report. And believe it or not, this year, one of the questions at play was, is the IPCC really the source for climate science, or are there perhaps other sources that are equally, deserving of merit and attention, which is to say, sources that may or may not be funded by the fossil fuel industry. So there are all sorts of attempts to weaken the negotiations, I'd say. And I think Canada helped retain the integrity of the COP process by keeping the IPCC as the gold standard for scientific research on climate change. What's the bad? Well, there are a bunch of bad things that happened, surprisingly, or not. So we talk about climate finance, right? The world has gotten pretty good at setting targets, and the world still has not gotten its act together in terms of international climate finance flows. So first of all, there's some people, and I'd say CAPE among them, that still has problems with the targets as such. But second, there's a lack of follow through, and in particular on two kinds of finance. One is grant based, so not a loan, but a grant, so giving the money in perpetuity. And then second, public, not private, which is to say, not some new scheme that delivers more money to the private sector actor, but country to country transmission of public finance so that we can adapt and mitigate climate change as a global community. So there's also those are part of the mix, but it's a very complicated file, and there's always a risk of the devil is always in the details on these climate finance commitments, and it will remain a major focus for future COPs. Is show me the money, basically. As I showed you with that map of the world, in terms of the number of countries that are critically insufficient on their climate progress, there remains a critical lack of follow through on climate action plans globally. In fact, countries are not even submitting their plans in time to the UNFCCC so that it can say bad or good. It can give you the evaluation. So there's a major kind of challenge around just overall level of enthusiasm and commitment and follow through. Canada won its first Fossil of the Day award in over a decade at COP30, which is to say, this is the award given. It's jokingly given. You can see the picture down there, the COP30 Fossil of the Day award. It's a little tongue in cheek. The idea being it's given to the country that's doing the best at being the worst. And so this is in the context of Carney's many major projects announcements, some of which involve liquefied natural gas exports overseas. Canada got, I think, justifiably a drubbing on the international stage saying, look, this isn't good enough and Canada needs to do better. And so we got Fossil of the Day, first time since Harper. And there was no consensus on the transition away from fossil fuels. I mentioned that there's a side process now. That's great, but it's not embedded or integrated into the COP discussion as such. What was ugly? Well, this is a picture actually of a fire that broke out on one of the last days of COP. I joke, there was a fire, there was a flood. I was half expecting locusts, but they did not descend on Brazil this time around. But so outside of the drama of the day-to-day mechanics, and actually 13 people were hospitalized for smoke inhalation in the context of this fire. So obviously not great. But let's zoom out. I mean, the ugly is the unraveling of international law. Where does COP sit when the United States can just kidnap the president of Venezuela? That's the world we're living in, and it's very bizarre to folks like myself who were born in the 1980s and grew up in a world where there was a thing called NATO and an international order. Seems to be quickly unraveling, and there's real questions about how COP is designed for a multilateral, liberal-based, international rules-based order, and we don't appear to be in that anymore. So there's real questions about what happens to COP going forward. A record concentration of fossil fuel lobbyists. By one tally, approximately 1 in 25 attendees this year were lobbyists for either the oil and gas sector or big agriculture. So that's a lot, and they would very intentionally be weakening negotiations all across the board. And I mentioned them already, but there was kind of a coalition of the unwilling. The U.S. Decided not to show up this year. And honestly, if Trump were really into dismantling the climate process, he should have shown up. They should have sent delegates to ruin things, but they didn't. I don't know if they just don't know what COP is and forgot about it. But in any case, other countries picked up the slack. And in this case, it was Saudi Arabia, Russia, and actually India this year. Were a bit of a coalition of the unwilling, blocking progress in a number of key areas. And again, that comes with the model, right? This is a consensus driven model. Geopolitics comes in, all sorts of other emphases come in terms of they bleed into the negotiations around climate change. And it can be disrupted by a few bad actors or by one bad actor quite easily. But I told you I'd have some hopeful messages at the end too. There are some green shoots, some opportunities, and areas of emerging leadership, both internationally and for Canada. So let's just look at Canada. On the domestic front, there's an opportunity to respond to the silliness we're seeing south of the border with a clean, connected Canadian energy grid from coast to coast. I think everyone sees it. Advocates, people inside the PMO, there's alignment on that, and I think there's a huge opportunity for a clean, connected grid. Strengthening of pollution pricing mechanisms, there also seems to be alignment on that. The Carney government seems to like the idea of industrial carbon pricing. And so the real question is, like, can we ratchet this thing up? It is, in the analysis of the Canadian Climate Institute, Canada's most important climate mitigation policy. So there's a lot to work with here. Folks in the current federal government might not remember, but when the Liberals were at COP28, they committed, along with the rest of the world, to tripling renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency by 2030, which is coming soon. There's a huge opportunity here. This is a build mindset. This is a growth mindset, and growth in the clean direction, right? There's all sorts of, I think, interesting opportunities that this kind of commitment can generate in terms of policy, and then in terms of private sector actors running around doing what they do and building out Canada's renewable energy industry. To do that, and here I'm going to zero in on some provinces, we need to lift moratoria. For example, the Alberta government has a moratorium on renewable development. Not good. It crushed and cratered the renewable industry in Alberta. So I'm hoping that either Daniel Smith has a change of heart, or a new government in the Alberta legislature can completely reverse course on that terrible policy. And also implement and fund the National Adaptation Strategy. This is actually, I mentioned this in passing, but the federal government actually rolled out a really ambitious plan to respond to the impacts of climate change within Canada. And unfortunately, like so many good ideas at the federal government, it's sitting somewhere on a shelf in someone's office, and no one's really cracked it open lately. It's a really important plan, and it requires funding and follow through. So the urge is to, and I personally urge policymakers every time I see them, which is relatively often, to fund this thing. It's important, and it requires a lot of money. So we can do that on the domestic front. And then we need to follow through on the existing regulations that we talked about. On the international stage, we can better integrate health messaging into climate discussions. And thankfully, there's actually a fair amount of interest from Canada's negotiators on that front. We can push for that global transition away from fossil fuels. I'd say, like, watch that space, because I think it'll be very interesting and might be generative in terms of possible policy shaping outcomes at the international level. We have to be more ambitious with climate finance pledges. And here I mean actually giving money and not just setting targets or talking about, the new finance scheme. And more generally, we need to basically follow through on our commitment to the developing world to respond to this, because all of those climate adaptation comments I made in Canada are far more dramatic, far more severe in the context of the developing world. And we should not forget the international justice element of this entire conversation, which we often do. So that's it. There's my email. There's my phone number. In case anyone wants to get a hold of me, happy to answer questions or connect you with folks who might have the answers to your questions, because it's a big space. But without any further ado, I'll stop the share and go to Q&A. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rob. There is one question in the chat, so I don't want to keep them waiting too much longer, because it also ties in really nicely to one of my questions, just about like looking a lot at like international commitments and high level policy. Versus like what can actually happen right now without necessarily having to wait for international processes or federal legislation to catch up. So,
yeah.
Can you see the question with the Q&A? I think I'll read it out loud, just because I don't think it's. I'll read it out loud because I don't think the rest of the group can see the questions.
Yeah, Lisa's question.
Yes. So in the Q&A, yeah, so she said, thank you so much for engaging in climate education. We committed to climate education in our international agreements. What role do you feel education plays in shifting policies and actions in the right directions? Do you think we can do more in terms of educating the public and decision makers? What more can we do? And do you think that the average individual understands the planet that they are living on?
Yeah, excellent questions. I'm just going to try to break it down to a few because there's a kind of like,
Yes.
so there's a few. There's a kind of like international versus domestic question, which comes up in COPs, right? So it's funny, this might surprise some of the folks on this call, but all those people in those international spaces walk around saying, we do the thing that we'd like to do if only we had the support back home. So what we really need to do is go back home and get the support so that we can come up to these international processes and implement the policies that we know we need. And then you hear the same thing at the federal level, right? The feds are saying, well, we do it if the voters wanted it to be done. And so what you need to do is go back and mobilize the voters so that and so there's this kind of like snake eating its own tail situation. But that's it. I do think, the international process needs to be in place. It's critical. But climate change will not be solved through a COP, right? Like the COP will set the big targets, and it's a confab, and it's a meeting of minds, and it's a policy space, and it's very valuable in a number of ways. And I think that you can even do an A to B when you look at where the world was at trajectory wise in terms of warming when the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, which was around like, my memory is escaping me on the details, but it was like around 3.5 or 4 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. You contrast that with where we're headed now, which is around like 2.5 degrees. Understanding, of course, that slide that showed critically highly insufficient progress across a number of areas, but we're still doing better. And part of that is because of the international context. But all the movement has to take place at the domestic level. So absolutely, like you can't really organize well. I'm a little biased here because I used to run a city-based organizing group called Ecology Ottawa, and we knocked on doors in neighborhoods, right? You can mobilize and organize a neighborhood very, very easily. It's harder to organize a province. It's even harder to organize a country. It's even, I don't know, how you organize internationally. Like that's really hard. So I'd say like the key is domestic action. Whether it's education is a good question. Like that gets me to the second part of the answer. I think education is critical, and I agree. I mean, I think that we're right to prioritize that to a certain extent, but I think that we can actually go beyond education into maybe something called like engagement or mobilization, right? To actually involve the actors. So it's one thing to tell a person what the facts are and to share that information with them. But it's another thing to win over hearts and minds, and it's a third thing to show them where they fit in the whole thing. And sometimes they'll only know if they do that, they engage in some way. It's easier said than done, right? And here what I mean is like maybe it's like a community solar co-op, maybe it's like uh, you know um, like a small NGO that gathers people around certain ideas. Maybe it's like meeting with a public official on a big plan at a key moment, moving forward on one or two specific policy ideas. All that is to say, I mean, I think that yeah, I agree that it's really important that we do educate. The last question, do you think? What is it? Well, there was a question about whether the average citizen knows what's
Just
happening.
understands the planet they live on.
Yeah, and I think the answer is no. Clearly, no. The average person does not understand the planet they live on. Absolutely not. Like, and so yeah, there's a huge gap there, right? I think back when I took grad school in policy, I was studying something called ecological economics, and that's like a bit of a twist on conventional economics because it factors in biophysical limits to the system, right? There's this kind of, and David Suzuki, perhaps foremost among public critics of modern economic theory, which is the idea that you can have infinite growth in a closed system is patently very silly. And yet we all operate, I say we all, governments, finance people operate under the assumption that that's totally viable. And so, yeah, I do think education is necessary because something like ecological economics is a kind of a frame adjustment that's required systematically if we're going to really grapple with the consequences of pollution on the planet. So I do think there's a lot more work to be done. I will say, though, that, I've got an old boss named Graham Saul, who talks about the idea that, recycling came along only in the last few decades. And yet we went from a world in which people would just throw their garbage wherever to one that's like where people feel like it's actually like morally incumbent on them to do the thing to recycle, even whether or not recycling does all the things that we want it to do is another question. But it's become embedded in the way that some people even just conceive of themselves. I'm not the kind of person who pollutes or throws my trash out. And I think there's more to be done in terms of inculcating that deeper understanding of like where we sit in the world, inside the hearts and minds of everyone in the world. So I do think that we're on our way. There's a lot more work to be done, but there has been progress. So I mean, the optimist in me always points back to the fact that we have changed pretty dramatically in a few decades. And to be fair, it's really difficult to measure or to message climate change. We're talking about what invisible gases do in some long-term, future, right? Like it's a really strange communications challenge. And so I think we're getting a handle on how to do it better. And I would encourage us all to just stick with it because there will be more opportunities.
I really
Um,
appreciate if you don't mind, I really appreciate the framing around mobilization. Because I think like you said, it's one thing to just throw the evidence and the data, but I believe that you do get to a point where there's a bit of a disconnect between how much information can you take in, but then in a way, it almost like impedes your ability to act because it gets so overwhelming, and that's just coming from somebody not working at the high level. This is just more how I engage with those around me. Um, so we have a few more questions. We have lots of questions. I'm just going to go to the Q&A first, and then I'll make my way to the chat. If you don't mind putting the Q&A, just so we can keep a track. So this next one, what is your assessment of the health effects of microplastics, and who is working on this domestically and internationally, and how should this be addressed?
Great question. I always have to premise things by telling people how little I know about most things. My wife actually works on toxics with the federal government, so she's upstairs. I could call her down to give a lecture on microplastics, but obviously that would be a bit of a strange thing. So I will say more seriously, there is a coalition that's active in the space on toxic chemicals. It's a Coalition for Action on Toxics, or CAT, and CAPE is a member. And my colleague Jane MacArthur works all the time, like full time on toxics, and that includes microplastics. I don't have any quick assessment. I know that I saw a recent article, which many of you might have seen in The Guardian, about some studies being possibly incorrect in terms of the analysis. Um, but I know that it's an ongoing concern and an ongoing point of focus. So my quick answer is CAT is the big coalition. CAPE does work on it, and if anyone wants to be connected, I'd be happy to connect you to my colleague Jane, who'd be able to provide you with all sorts of information on microplastics in particular.
Great. So I'm just going to hop over to the chat because I just don't want to miss Elizabeth's question. She asked if you could please comment on the viability of the proposed LNG pipeline. It apparently depends on the private sector to fund it, and so far there's no buyers. Is Carney simply replacing Smith, knowing it will never happen?
Good question. And I think we were talking about two different things. There's the LNG export market, which is LNG terminals, and this is a BC thing for the most part. Although there's some interest in the Maritimes as well for LNG exports. And here the big there are some LNG terminals that are getting built on the West Coast. Sims was one of the major projects I think that got announced by Carney. I think there's one in Kitimat too. There's a few that are coming. Wood Fiber LNG and LNG Canada is like the project name for it. So that stuff is kind of rolling. It's going ahead. It's now the exports have begun. Whether that continues or is sustained really depends on gas markets. As the question implies, that the private sector plays a key role here. And gas markets are different from the international oil markets. International crude prices can differ pretty radically from natural gas prices, which are much more localized. And now I'm like at the edge of my knowledge of like the economics of gas versus oil. But all that is to say, so that's one thing, the LNG exports, that's happening, but there are questions about the viability for sustained exports. although the feds are clearly betting that this is a viable export for them economically, and they think there are enough private sector proponents to move forward. On the pipeline piece, I think that'll be more likely an oil and gas pipeline, and in particular a bitumen pipeline. And bitumen is a very unique substance. It's heavy crude, and it's hard to move through pipes. So, and the reason I know this is because there was under Harper a variety of proposed pipelines from the Alberta oil patch all over the country. And one of them was called Energy East, and that was slated to run through the boundaries of the city of Ottawa, transport over 1 million barrels a day of bitumen out to basically, what was it, New Brunswick, and then for export overseas. And bitumen needs to be cut with a whole bunch of agents, including like diluent, which is like basically like to let it flow through the pipe. So it's a bit of a different beast. It'll have a very different impact because of the nature of the substance that's being shipped. A different impact in communities. And so when there have been bitumen spills, they've been pretty dramatic. I'm thinking Kalamazoo, Michigan had a big spill in like 2011 or so. And that's something that my old organization, Ecology Ottawa, zeroed in on to talk about as a. Oh, did I lose you? Am I still on?
Yeah, you're good.
Oh, good. Okay, I just my screen just popped up. So all this is to say, LNG is happening. Will it slow? I'm not sure. The pipeline itself, the Alberta pipelines, good question. There hasn't been a private sector proponent. I've heard smart people come at it from totally different angles. I think the general sense is that they probably will find a private sector proponent, but what the private sector will push for is public subsidies and backing so that it's safe for the private sector to come in. And we all know what happened under Trudeau, which is that they bought a pipeline, right? So I think the public is sensitized enough that it knows that it's probably going to be a bad deal to buy another pipeline. But it's incumbent on groups like ours to make that case. And I think that that's one of the easiest cases to make, which is like, do Canadian taxpayers really want to be on the hook for another pipeline? Because that looks like that's what the oil and gas industry wants in order to proceed. And I'd say the only other thing, too, that's related to fossil fuel subsidies is carbon capture and storage, which is another feature of a lot of these projects, where the industry almost always says, we would build carbon capture and storage if only the Canadian taxpayer subsidized the entire thing. And that's a fight we can win, which is to say, heck no, we're not going to subsidize your fossil fuel industry. Like there's so many smarter bets purely in economic terms that we can make. And then of course we can also make the climate and health case. But I think it's one where we might win on the merits of the economics alone, which is always a good thing.
Yeah. I guess shifting from the economics purely, there was someone else had asked if you, staying on that topic, I guess, of the LNG and the crude oil, if you know any of the impacts on Indigenous communities, just a more local level.
Yeah, no, there are tremendous impacts in both cases on Indigenous communities. One of our physicians, Dr. Melissa Lim, works closely with, she's based in Vancouver, but she does a lot of work all across the province in BC, including with lots of First Nations that are often on the front lines of a lot of these oil and gas projects. And there are effects. And you know, one of the things that Melissa notes when I hear her speak publicly and when I've talked to her about it is that the folks who can leave a lot of these communities are starting to leave the communities, right? Because they know, or they're starting to experience negative health impacts from fracking, and they know that it's time to get out. But First Nations, whose ancestral land this stuff is on, don't want to leave, right? For a number of reasons. There are a number of attachments to the land. So there are real questions about how to mitigate that. And it's a very dynamic space, I'd say, politically, because what you'll see is oil and gas companies going in and getting some First Nations on side because they'll cut a deal where the First Nation will benefit economically from the project, right? And so yes. Once again, it's incumbent on the folks who care about health and the environment to also have those conversations and to make the case, I think, back to the education piece, so that First Nations know what they're dealing with when they're dealing with something like this. We can point to other examples where fracking has come into a community and wrecked a community. So that's on the LNG side. On the oil and gas side, I mean, the feds actually finally announced a study on, I think it's on rare cancers in the Fort McMurray area. Part of the challenge, I think, historically has been the population concentrations are pretty low. So
Right.
it's hard to do, robust population study in terms of the effects of cancers. But the anecdotal data is like all over the map, right? It's saying like, we're not all over the map, but it's pretty prominent saying like, look, these are cancers that aren't showing up anywhere else. They showed up after the oil and gas industry showed up here. And so it's a live issue. Again, I'm not an expert in medicine, but I would watch that space because I think if it's the more the case is made that a lot of these things cause massive impacts, the harder it will be for the oil and gas industry to get its social license that it so requires in order to proceed with any of these projects.
Yeah, that's very true. I was just in rural Alberta visiting my family, and the sentiment there is very similar of lots of discussions around, wanting to almost pull in Indigenous communities as leverage because they know that that's important, and um, it's just really interesting to see that like the way that it's very divided there as well. Um, so we have. I'm going to go to the next question. We have two here. Is there anything CAPE can do to bring greater awareness on the connection between human and planetary health to the general public? We'll just start with that one.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more we can do. I mean, I think that I love I love opportunities like this to connect with people and talk to real people, even across a Zoom screen, because I think that things like this are important occasions where we can focus our minds on issues like this. Amid all the other things that folks on this call are doing, and many of us probably work in the climate space, but often work past each other, right? It's a very complex space. And so the planetary health lens is an important consideration. Can we do more? I mean, always. I think, for Kate, one of the opportunities is around better communications, external communications in terms of like digital advertising and others. And I will say, like, if there are any enterprising funders or grant makers out there who care about the environment, I mean, we're getting swamped. If anyone here lives in Ottawa and you walk downtown in the summer or in the winter, you will see oil and gas billboards everywhere you go, right? They're winning. They're winning the communications fight. And so it's something where we need to play catch up in terms of what is our message? Who are we messaging to? And how do we make the case? So there's the kind of like in-person conversations, let's say in First Nations communities or other communities affected by oil and gas development. But then there's also the conversation with policymakers and the public at large. And I think, as always, the risk for an environmental organization is that we speak to a very narrow subset of the population, right? People are educated, they often have multiple degrees. They're already concerned about the issue. They consider themselves activists. They usually lean left to center. It's a slice of the electorate that's important, but we need to think about all the different ways we can appeal to a much broader slice of the electorate and how we can make different cases in different contexts. Right? Kate tries to make the health case, but there's also the economic case. I mean, we talked about pipeline economics there for a second. There are a bunch of different avenues by which we can appeal to different slices of the public or the electorate to make this case. And I think that just so much more work needs to be done.
Thank you. I just noticed that the other question is quite similar. It's saying the meeting in April 2026 in Colombia on the transition away from fossil fuels coming up COP30 will be significant. So again, like what can civil society groups like ours do to support that initiative? And if you don't mind me adding on quickly, one of the things that I noted from the end of your presentation was in the good, you noted like the just transition agreed upon. And then in the bad, says no consensus on transitions away from fossil fuels. So I'm just wondering also um, for civil society's role in also untangling that tension.
Yeah, great questions. I mean, I think just on the topic of just transition, I would say it means radically different things in different contexts. And here I'm thinking, so first of all, Alberta, a little while ago, the Alberta government under Danielle Smith um, was very hostile to the phrasing just transition. And as I heard it pitched, as I understand it, and I think this is a good faith reading, Daniel Smith was saying that the formulation said just transition, as in like, why don't you just transition? And I think that that's how she read it and how a lot of Albertans read it. When I think the UN phrasing means like a justice oriented transition. So there's some just fundamental misunderstandings about like what the phrasing means, and because of that, Canada basically ruled out the use of just transition domestically. They had to basically to appease Alberta in its complaints, and so we started talking about sustainable jobs instead. It became sustainable jobs. That's Canada's sustainable job strategy. But I think sustainable jobs look like very different things in different contexts, right? I think, if you're an Albertan who's wondering, and Leah, you got family in Alberta, right? And I do too. You're wondering what your future looks like away from oil and gas. And a lot of the policy discussion in Canada is like, how do we keep all the things that we have while moving to another thing? And what are the things that we have?
Absolutely.
Well, we've got a big F-150, and we've got lots of toys, right? Like, and so there's a real question about like, does the renewable energy pay the same, and is it going to be the exact same suite of opportunities, or is it going to be different? And so I think there's like some, and it's a very different conversation there than it is when you're talking to indigenous communities in the Amazon, right? Like radically different conversation about what it means to not have the money from oil and gas in that context. So yeah, I would say there are a number of disagreements, and that there are smarter people than me working on the policy, but also like the messaging at the domestic and international levels. I'd say on the transition away from fossil fuels piece, going back to the comment about the upcoming meeting to watch in Colombia, I mean, absolutely. I don't know. Some of these meetings are open and some of them are closed to the public. I'm not sure where the Colombia one sits in terms of its openness to public delegations. It might just be, kind of similar to those early COPs, where it's the policymakers, a few academics, and that's it, right? That's who's in the room, and maybe that's fine. But if the question is how does civil society get engaged, I mean, the vehicle is almost always through the national government of the country that you're in. So it's talk to the feds about it. And I know that's easier said than done, but it's through organizations like CAPE and others that we can kind of collaborate and get the FaceTime with the minister or the prime minister to make the case. I think that's definitely a vehicle by which you could influence that kind of negotiation. And then, maybe it'll be like a sign-on letter saying like, these are the 8 things that we want to see coming out of this meeting. I don't know yet. It hasn't really evolved yet since the declaration by Lula that it would take place. But I think that those are spaces to watch the NGO space. And if anyone's interested, I mean, you all have agency, right? Like email the groups, email me. Like I can connect you with people who might be working on the issue when I find them, because it's a pretty dynamic space that way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, that's also why I love being in spaces like this, but we always try to emphasize it's important to not just have the conversations here. There's like 20 of us who are very like-minded, decently, I mean, for the most part, all on the same page. But it's one thing to then translate this into actual action, which is it's the difficult part, it's the tiring part, but it's the most important. And I guess just wrapping up, um, bringing it back into the context, especially my head's been wrapped around the last few days. Um, the news for me has all just about Mark Carney's speech in Davos, about fragility of multilateralism, and the importance of middle power cooperation. And I guess just wrapping it up, because a lot of people are placing weight on that speech, which is interesting because it's something that a lot of us we've been saying over and over again. This is nothing new for us, but to see it, I guess, play out on an international stage like that, outside of the context of climate and health, but just in general, overall, do you see like a shift in multilateral cooperation, perhaps without the actors? Do you see that as an opportunity for Canada to maybe find these new routes of coalition building rather than perhaps just sticking to the way things have been?
I do. I really do. And maybe, Leah, if I may, I just noticed a comment from Tim around the Reclimate messaging, and I'll connect that to
Yes.
the answer too, right? Because Reclimate is an amazing group. They're based at Carleton University. They do analysis on climate communications, and I would second Tim's point that their research is really important. And some of the audiences for climate communications, we can go beyond our little bubble of what they would call progressive activists, the folks on this call, right? To other groups like Civic Nationals. This might be, someone holding down 2 jobs, does not have advanced degrees, but somehow is deeply concerned about nature conservation and maybe the future for their kids, right? So there's different audiences and different avenues. for all of these things. Now, maybe it doesn't tie directly, Leah, to your question around the future for multilateralism. But I mean, I read Carney's speech. I listened to Carney's speech. It's powerful, useful, and timely. I agree with the speech, and I think the idea is like we don't need for a long time, actually since the dawn of its creation, Canada's always looked had a big brother somewhere, right? It was like if it's France or maybe it's the UK or it's the US, and it's like it's time to grow up a little bit and move out of the house, right? It's time to go our own way. And to your point specifically, there, I think there's two ways in which being tied to the U.S. economy ties us down in terms of the energy transition. One is the oil and gas that is produced in Alberta. A lot of those pipelines point south, right? And so they're processed in refineries in Illinois and in Louisiana, and then exported. So there's like a fossil fuel economy that like transcends those barriers, and there's real questions that Canada needs to ask itself about the future of the fossil fuel economy in that context, especially in the context of a belligerent neighbor to the south. The second way is the auto industry. Like Carney's right before he did the thing at Davos, he did a thing in Beijing where he made a new trade deal with China, which is around electrifying Canada's EV fleet. And I saw different reactions. I saw like Canadian Labour Congress not so enthusiastic about that deal, but a lot of the folks in the environmental space were very enthusiastic about that deal because it means more electric vehicle options, and it means not tying ourselves to the North American auto industry, which seems very intent on building more Ford F-150s, and as opposed to the BYD self-parking electric car. I'm not saying that's going to solve the climate challenge, but I will say that like diversification of markets and a move towards electrification, which is clearly where China wants to go, is probably very smart in terms of long-term thinking. And so it might mean more disentangling from the U.S. economy. And already we're seeing the numbers add up in terms of where are exports going. The shift is already underway in terms of moving away from the U.S. economy. I know it's been a goal of prime ministers since the dawn of time to like disentangle from the U.S. market, but like I think it's finally happening because we're getting the wake-up call every time we turn on the news and Trump says something new and interesting about Canada.
Yeah, it's you can't keep track of it. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I think that that's a nice place to wrap it up if you're okay with that. I want to give you a chance. Anything else that you wanted to add before we end it?
One more thing, these things always go through cycles, right? Everyone who's on this call has seen these cycles before. Sometimes green is in, sometimes it's not. We're in a period where we're in a lag and the numbers and data look alarming, but it will swing back around. And the question is really like, are we ready for when that happens? And what are we going to ask and what are we going to implement when the policy window aligns again? And it will align, I think, sooner than we all think, because the problem isn't going away. The solutions are cheaper than ever, and the whole geopolitical reality is like shifting under our feet. So I think that there's all sorts of opportunities around, and I encourage us all to stay positive, optimistic. I know I am, despite some of the dire news that I presented today. And I just want to thank everyone for sticking around and asking questions.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I really, really appreciate the optimism. That's something that everybody needs right now. So thank you also everyone that attended, and thank you for your wonderful questions that gave us more to talk about.
Thank you.
Comments. Thank you so much. Okay, bye everyone.